The bell has just sounded. Cameras live. Lights on me. 20,000 people on their feet. Sabine Corvino, newly crowned undisputed champion, crosses the canvas toward me with blood at her eyebrow and her gloves still laced, and she pulls me into an embrace the broadcast will describe as pure sportsmanship. Her mouth finds my ear under the roar of the arena, her heartbeat against my ribs, and she says the one sentence that will undo every story I have told myself about the last 4 years. I do not answer. My coach is already cutting my raps. The cameras are still rolling. And whatever happens next is going to cost us both something we have not begun to count. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The rivalry started when we were both 22. Sabine was already being called the best American female boxer of her generation. She had a 12-0 record, a sponsor deal with a luxury watchmaker, and the kind of press coverage that treated her every fight like a cultural event. I was 11-0 with a sponsor deal from a regional gym chain and a Wikipedia page nobody had updated in 6 months. We fought the first time at a stacked undercard in Las Vegas, 140 pounds, 10 rounds. Everyone assumed Sabine would finish me inside 4. She did not. I went the distance and lost a split decision that 2 of the 3 judges called the best fight of the year. The handshake after the bell lasted 1 second too long. I wrote it off as adrenaline. The second fight was 18 months later. I won a unanimous decision in Brooklyn. Sabine had dominated the first 6 rounds and then made one adjustment error in the 7th that I had trained 6 months to exploit. And I exploited it in a way that turned the last 3 rounds into the best boxing of my career. She stood in the ring after the decision was announced with her face arranged into the public composure she had been performing since she was a teenager, and she looked at me across the canvas for longer than made sense, and she said something to her trainer that nobody on the broadcast could hear. I found out later from a cutman who worked both our camps that what she had said was, "She is better than me at reading angles." It was the kindest thing she had ever said about me. It was also the kind of comment you do not forget a fighter making. That was 18 months before the weigh-in. In the intervening time, we had each defended titles against other women, given interviews in which we called each other overrated and dangerous in approximately equal measure, and agreed through our respective teams to a third fight for the undisputed junior welterweight championship. The fight would be in Las Vegas again. Symmetry, the promoter said, pleased with himself. The circle closing. My coach, Orla Dempsey, was the only person in my life who had stopped pretending the rivalry was only about boxing. Orla had been training fighters for 27 years and had the particular bluntness of a woman who had watched too many careers implode over things nobody had wanted to name. She asked me, 6 weeks out from the fight, over coffee in the back office of the gym, "Are you going to tell me what the problem actually is?" I said, "My jab has been short for 2 sessions." "I know." She said, "That is not the problem I was asking about." I drank my coffee. The gym smelled like old leather and fresh tape, and the bleach Orla used on the mats. Through the open door, I could hear my sparring partner, Kez Delamort, running the speed bag in a rhythm that was 1 notch too fast. I said, "There is no problem." Orla said, "Remy, you went 6 rounds at shadowboxing this morning, and all 6 rounds you were throwing at something specifically. What was it?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "We have been together for 9 years. You want to try that answer again?" I did not. I did not try any answer. I watched the steam from my coffee and thought about Sabine Corvino in the 2nd round of our 2nd fight. The way she had stepped forward into a right hand instead of away from it, because she had read me and decided the only way to shut me down was to stop giving me space. I thought about the specific feeling of landing a clean punch on someone who was not protecting herself and who wanted me, specifically, to know that she could take it. I said. She looks at me in press conferences like she is checking something. Orla said. Like what? I said. I do not know. Like she is verifying that I am still the same person she remembered. Orla set her coffee down. Her face did the small thing her face did when she had already figured out an answer she was not going to tell me yet. She said, Fight Sabine. Then we talk. 3 weeks later, I flew to Las Vegas for Fight Week. The first press conference was in the ballroom of the hotel where both of us were being housed. The promoter had asked us to sit side by side at the table because it made for a better broadcast. Orla had told him in private what she thought of the staging choice. The promoter had done it anyway. Sabine came in after me. She always came in after me. It was a small psychological play, the kind of thing fighters do without thinking about it anymore. She was in a tailored black suit. She was, for the record, 5'7" and weighed 140 pounds on the nose, and wore suits with the kind of precision that made them seem like armor rather than clothing. Her dark hair was pulled back in a knot at the base of her neck. She did not wear jewelry at press events. She did not wear makeup. She did not need to. She sat down beside me. She did not look at me. She did not look at me for the entire 20 minutes the promoter spent walking through the fight card. She did not look at me when the moderator asked her about her training camp. She did not look at me when I was asked about my game plan and I said, into the microphone, that I intended to do to her in the third fight exactly what I had done to her in the second, only earlier. I watched the muscle in her jaw move once. The moderator asked Sabine to respond. She said, Remy Aguilar talks about angles like she invented geometry. She has a 9-round stretch of good boxing against me from 3 years ago, and she has been monetizing it ever since. On Saturday, I intend to end the conversation. She said it without looking at me. She said it with the composure she had been performing since she was a teenager. The room ate it up. My team ate it up. Orla, behind me, did not eat it up, because Orla was the only person in the room who had been watching Sabine's hands. Sabine's hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her knuckles were white. The press conference ended. The room emptied in stages, reporters drifting toward the lobby, camera teams breaking down lights, Sabine's team surrounding her in the loose formation they used at public events. I waited until most of the room had cleared before I stood up. Orla put her hand on my shoulder as I passed. She said, Easy. I said, What? She said, Whatever you are about to do, think about it for 30 seconds first. I did not think about it for 30 seconds. I walked across the ballroom to where Sabine was packing the notes she had not used into a leather folder, and I stood beside her and I said, End the conversation. Interesting word choice. She did not look up. She said, Let me work. I said, Was that a prepared line, or did you make it up on the spot? She closed the folder. She turned. She looked at me for the first time in 35 minutes, and I understood, with the specific clarity that only ever arrives in rooms full of people you have spent years watching, that I had caught her at something. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the ballroom light. She was looking at me the way she looked at me in the 7th round of our second fight, which was the look of a woman who was trying to solve a problem she could not afford to get wrong. She said, Aguilar, walk away. I said, You walk away. She said, I am walking away. Let me go. I said, I am not holding you. She looked at my mouth. It was a half second. Less. The kind of glance that would not register on a broadcast replay, that could be explained away as a person's eyes, tracking a face the way eyes track faces. It registered on me. I cataloged it. I had been training my eyes on Sabine Corvino's eyes for 4 years, and I knew the difference between her ordinary attention and whatever this was. She picked up the folder and walked out of the ballroom. I stood there for a long moment. Orla came up behind me. She did not say anything. She just stood beside me and breathed for a few seconds the way she breathed at the end of a 12-round sparring session. Then she said, "Okay." I said, "Okay, what?" She said, "Okay. Now I understand what I have been watching." She walked me back to my hotel room. She did not elaborate. She left me at the door with a pat on the shoulder and the instruction to sleep. I did not sleep. The weigh-in was the next morning at 10. The weigh-in room was a hallway off the main ballroom. The promoters had set up a backdrop and a scale and a staging area where fighters stood off camera before being called forward. The hallway was maybe 8 feet wide. It was meant to be briefly transited. It was not meant to be a room where two women ran out of space. I got there early. I always got there early. Orla had been drilling me for years on the principle that the fighter who owns the space first owns the space. Sabine, who had been trained by Vic Keller, a legendary trainer who had died 2 years earlier, and whose methods Sabine still followed with devotional precision, followed the opposite principle. Arrive last. Enter with weight. I stood at my end of the hallway in a tracksuit and a robe. My team was behind me. Kez had my water. Orla was on my right. The promoter's staff were doing the dance of herding cameras and credentialed press toward the weigh-in backdrop at the far end. Sabine entered from the opposite end of the hallway. She came in with her team, her trainer, an old boxer named Jem Halberstam, her cutman, her manager, a woman in a suit who carried a tablet and never spoke to anyone who was not Sabine. Sabine herself was in a dark tracksuit, hood up. She did not look at me. There was an interval of 8 minutes when both teams were in the hallway, and nothing was happening because the weigh-in before ours was running long. 8 minutes is a long time in a narrow hallway. 8 minutes is long enough for a boxer who has been sitting inside a controlled bad feeling for 14 months to decide she is tired of sitting inside it. I do not know exactly who moved first. I know that I was standing against the left wall with my water bottle in my hand, and Orla was talking to the commission official about the scale calibration, and Sabine was leaning against the opposite wall with her hood up and her eyes closed. I know that I turned my head and she opened her eyes and she was already looking at me, and had probably been looking at me for some measurable period of time. I know that I pushed off the wall and crossed the hallway. I know that she pushed off her wall to meet me. I know that I said, quietly, because there were people 20 feet away on either side, and this was not a moment any of them were supposed to register. "Is there something you need to say to me?" She said, "There is nothing I need to say to you." I said, "Then stop looking at me like there is." She said, "Aguilar." I said, "What?" She stepped closer. This is the part that matters. She stepped closer, and the hallway, which had always been narrow, became small in the particular way rooms become small when two people close the distance themselves. I could smell the rosin on her tape. I could smell the particular clean scent of the hotel laundry they had pressed her tracksuit in. I could see the pulse at the base of her throat moving in a rhythm that was not the rhythm of a woman who had her resting heart rate under control. She put her hand flat on the wall beside my head. She did not push. But her arm was between me and the hallway behind me, and the configuration of our bodies was, at that moment, visibly the configuration of two people who were not about to politely walk past each other. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I do not know." I said, "Then move." She looked at my mouth. This time it was not a half second. This time she looked at my mouth for what I would later, in a hotel room at 1 in the morning, calculate as 2 full seconds. 2 seconds is a long time to look at a specific part of another person's face in a hallway outside a weigh-in while your arm is braced against the wall beside her head. I said, loudly, for the cameras that were not yet there, "What the hell are you looking at?" She kissed me. It was not a soft kiss. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kind of kiss a fighter gives another fighter when she has been running the arithmetic of restraint for 14 months, and the arithmetic has finally collapsed. Her mouth was warm. Her hand on the wall did not move. Her other hand went to the collar of my robe, not pulling, just anchoring. The way you anchor yourself to a corner between rounds when you are not sure the floor is going to hold you up. I did not push her away. That was the first thing I had to account for later. I did not push her away. I had spent 4 years cataloging the specific physical sensation of Sabine Corvino's hands on my body in a ring, where her hands on my body was the whole professional premise, and I had told myself every one of those times that what I was cataloging was combat. I had lied. I had been lying for 4 years, and the moment her mouth was on my mouth, I knew I had been lying, because my body did not react the way it reacted to combat. It reacted the way it reacted to the 1 or 2 things in my life that had ever genuinely unmade me. She pulled back after maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds is long enough to know something. 3 seconds is short enough that a person 20 feet away, glancing in the wrong direction, could have missed it entirely. We stood there. Her arm was still on the wall beside my head. Her other hand was still on my collar. She said, very quietly, "I am so sorry." I said nothing. She took her hand off my collar. She took her arm off the wall. She stepped back. The promoter's staff called her name from the end of the hallway. She turned and walked to the scale. I do not remember the weigh-in. I remember standing on the scale. I remember the number coming up right. I remember the face-off, the part where the 2 fighters stand nose to nose for the cameras, which I had done maybe 40 times in my career and had never, until that morning, done with a person whose mouth had been on mine 40 minutes earlier. Sabine's face in the face-off was arranged into exactly the composure she had been performing since she was a teenager. She did not look me in the eye. She looked at the middle of my forehead. She held the stare for the allotted 5 seconds. The cameras clicked. The promoter said something. We separated. In the hallway on the way out, Orla took my arm. She said, "Talk." I said, "Not yet." She said, "Remy." I said, "Orla, not yet. Please." She let go of my arm. She did not ask again. That was one of the reasons I had been with her for 9 years. The fight was the next night. I want to be honest about the fight. I was scared going into it. Not of Sabine's hands, which I had been training against for 4 years, and which I understood better than I understood most things in my life. I was scared of the 11 hours between the weigh-in and the fight, during which I had to sit inside what had happened in the hallway and come out the other side of it still being a boxer. I did it. I sat in my hotel room from noon until 8 in the evening, and I did not call anyone, and I did not answer my phone, and I ran through Orla's fight script in my head approximately 40 times. I ate the meals my nutritionist had prepared. I napped for 90 minutes. I did not think about Sabine's mouth on my mouth. I did, obsessively, continuously, but I did it from the narrow professional corner of my mind that could hold it without letting it metastasize into the rest of me. The fight was 12 rounds for the undisputed title. Nobody will ever be able to describe what that fight actually was, because what that fight was existed between me and Sabine and was not visible to the cameras. The cameras saw 2 elite fighters going 12 rounds at a pace that broadcasters later called generational. They saw Sabine establish her jab in the first 3 rounds. They saw me counter with bodywork in the 4th and 5th. They saw the championship rounds, the 7th through the 10th, turn into the kind of sustained technical boxing that people were going to study for the next 20 years. What the cameras did not see was every clinch. A clinch in boxing is the moment when 2 fighters, for reasons of fatigue or tactics or the need to disrupt a rhythm, tie up at close range and the referee has to separate them. A clinch is intimate in a way that nothing else in the sport is intimate. A clinch is your face in someone's neck, their arms around your arms, the specific weight of them against you, the feeling of their heartbeat against your ribs. Sabine and I clinched 11 times in 12 rounds. I counted. Every one of those 11 times, she held me a quarter second longer than tactics required. Every one of those 11 times, I felt the held quarter second. Every one of those 11 times, the referee pulled us apart and we went back to fighting, and the fighting was the cleanest and most committed and most technically honest fighting of my career, because we were both, by round 6, using the fight as the only vocabulary we had for the thing that had happened in the hallway. She won by unanimous decision. It was not a bad decision. She had edged the 7th and 10th rounds, and I had won the 4th and the 9th, and the 3 championship rounds had been close enough that any judge could have gone either way. 2 judges scored it 116 to 112 for Sabine. One scored it 115 to 113. I did not contest the decision. You do not contest decisions in fights you respect. In the center of the ring, when the announcement was finished, she came to me. She embraced me the way winners embrace the losers they have the most respect for. She held me with her gloved hands against my back. Her mouth was at my ear. She said, "I am sorry about the hallway." I said, "Do not be." She said, "I crossed a line." I said, "We crossed it together. Do not take the whole thing." She pulled back. She looked at me. Her face was cut above the left eyebrow where I had landed a clean right hand in the 11th. My lip was split. We were both shiny with sweat and blood and the petroleum jelly Cutman use. Her mouth was an inch from my ear, and she was looking at me with the specific expression of a woman who had been told for 14 months that she was not allowed to have a specific thing, and had spent 12 rounds inside a ring, finding out that not being allowed to have it had not removed the wanting. She said, "I want to talk to you." I said, "Okay." She said, "Not tonight." I said, "Okay." She said, "I will call you." I said, "Okay." She stepped back. The commission official raised her arm. Her corner closed around her. I went to my corner. Orla was already cutting my hand wraps. Kez was pressing ice against my cheekbone. The arena was loud. I did not cry. I would have been embarrassed to cry. But I sat on the stool in my corner while Orla cut the wraps, and I felt the specific feeling of losing a fight to a woman I had just spent 14 months calling my rival, and understanding, in real time, that the word rival had stopped covering what she actually was to me at some point I could not identify. The post-fight press conference was at midnight. We sat at a different table than the pre-fight table. Same hotel, same room, different table. Sabine sat beside me. She was in a clean tracksuit. She had ice on her eyebrow. She answered questions in the same composed register she had been using for 10 years. She praised my boxing. She called the fight the hardest fight of her career. She thanked her team. The reporters asked me how I felt. I said I felt fine. I said Sabine had boxed the better fight. I said I would request a rematch. I said, when they asked me about specific moments, the specific technical things that had happened in specific rounds, and none of those answers were about the 11 clinches. At the end of the press conference, the promoter asked if we would do a photograph together with the belts. Sabine stood. I stood. We posed with the belts between us. She held the unified title around her shoulder with her right hand. My left hand was on the other end of the belt. Our hands did not touch. The cameras clicked. The photograph would run in sports pages all over the country the next morning. She leaned in, under the noise of the shutter, and said, "Tomorrow afternoon. Your room. Send me the number." I said, "I will." We separated. The next afternoon at 2, there was a knock at my door. I opened it. Sabine was in the hallway in dark jeans and a gray sweatshirt with the hood down, hair down, no makeup, a butterfly bandage over her left eyebrow. She looked like a woman who had slept for 4 hours and had spent every hour of the rest of the time thinking. She said, "Can I come in?" I said, "Yes." She came in. The hotel room was one of the fight night suites, larger than the room I had slept in all week. The curtains were drawn because I was still recovering and the afternoon light was sharp. A room service tray sat on the coffee table with a half-eaten sandwich and a cold cup of tea. Sabine looked at the tray. She said, "You have not been eating." I said, "I will eat later." She said, "That is what I said for 2 weeks after Brooklyn." It was the first reference either of us had ever made to the fact that we had been paying specific non-professional attention to each other for longer than we had admitted. She sat in the chair by the window. I sat on the edge of the bed. The room was quiet. The hotel hum was the only sound. She said, "I want to tell you the real version of what happened in the hallway." I said, "Okay." She said, "I have known for about 2 years." I said, 2 years. She said, Since the week before Brooklyn, I came out of a sparring session at my gym in the afternoon, and the front desk had a package for me. It was a book. Nobody had signed for it. The sender was a bookstore in Albany. I do not know anyone in Albany. I said, I sent you that. She said, I know. I said, how? She said, the bookstore. When I called them, told me that a woman had come in 3 weeks before and paid cash for a copy of Training with the Enemy by Vic Keller and had asked them to ship it to my gym. Vic had been dead 9 months. The book was his last book. It had sold maybe 1,500 copies. You had sent me a copy of my dead trainer's book that I had been unable to find after his funeral because his estate was still being sorted out. I said, I did not want you to know who sent it. She said, I knew the second I opened the package. I knew you had read the interview where I said I could not find a copy. I knew you had gone and found one. I knew you had not wanted your name on the gift because you did not want me to have to thank you. I knew all of that in about 15 seconds standing in the reception of my gym, and I have been unable to think about you the same way since. I sat on the bed. My face hurt. My ribs hurt. Every part of me that was not the part of me that was listening to Sabine Corvino talk hurt. I said, you did not tell me. She said no. I said, why? She said, because we had a fight coming up, and because we had been calling each other names for 2 years in public, and because I did not know what to do with a gift from a woman I was supposed to be trying to beat. I said, you beat me. She said, I beat you in the ring, Remy. That is not the same thing. A silence. The hotel hummed. She said, the hallway was not planned. I said, I know. She said, I had been telling myself I could get through fight week. I had told myself every day since I signed the contract that I could get through fight week without looking at you. I looked at you in the press conference and I knew I was losing. I stood in that hallway for 8 minutes and watched you drink water against the wall, and I did the math, and I decided I would rather have 1 bad minute than 14 more months of pretending. I said, it was not a bad minute. She said, it was a bad minute. You did not consent. I said, I did not push you away. She said, that is not the same as consenting, and you know it. I looked at her. Her face was tired, and the bandage was doing an imperfect job, and her hands, folded in her lap, were trembling in a way that was not the trembling of a woman who had fought 12 championship rounds the night before. It was the different kind of trembling. I said, Sabine. She looked up. I said, I bought the book in Albany 8 months before Brooklyn. I had owned the copy for 8 months before I sent it to you. I read it 3 times before I could bring myself to put it in the mail. She did not say anything for a long moment. She said, why did you send it? I said, because you had said in the interview that you could not find one, and because I had read the interview 4 times, and because I knew where to get one, and because sending it to you was the only thing in that entire stretch of time that felt like I was being an honest person. She said, you were supposed to be my rival. I said, I was your rival. You were also the person I was paying closest attention to in my entire professional life. Those 2 things turned out to be the same thing. I did not know that when it started. I figured it out in Albany. She closed her eyes. She said, I need to tell you something you are not going to like. I said, tell me. She said, I am going to walk out of this room in about 20 minutes, and I am going to fly home, and I am not going to call you for at least a month. I said, why? She said, because I just won an undisputed title off a woman whose mouth I had been on 24 hours before the first bell, and the only way either of us survives what we just did is if I do not turn this into the story where I used a fight to get close to you. I need to put a wall of time between the hallway and whatever happens next. That is not a negotiation. That is the version of this where I get to keep being the person you sent the book to. I sat on the bed and looked at her. I said, a month. She said, at least. I said, okay. She said, you are not arguing. I said, no. She said, why not? I said, because you are right. Because I have known for 8 months that I was in love with you, and I have spent 8 months running the arithmetic of what that meant about me as a professional, and the only version of this where I come out the other side still being the boxer I want to be is the version where we put time between the fight and whatever this becomes. You are telling me you already did the arithmetic. I am not going to argue with the answer. She stood up. She walked across the room. She stopped at the foot of the bed. She did not sit down. She did not touch me. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me for a long moment with the specific expression of a woman who had just been told, by someone she had been preparing to apologize to, that the apology was not necessary. She said, "A month." I said, "A month." She said, "I will call you." I said, I know." She turned. She walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when she stopped. She did not turn around. She said, "For what it is worth. The hallway was the best minute of the last 2 years for me. I am sorry about the circumstances. I am not sorry about the minute." I said, "Nothing," because my throat had closed. She opened the door. She went through it. The door clicked shut behind her. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the cold cup of tea and the half-eaten sandwich, and the sharp afternoon light bleeding around the edges of the drawn curtain. And I understood that whatever I had been for the last 4 years of my professional life was over, and whatever I was going to be after this month was not yet real, and the only thing that existed, at 2:40 in the afternoon in a hotel suite in Las Vegas, was a door that had just closed and a phone that was not going to ring for at least 30 days. I picked up the tea. It was cold. I drank it anyway. I was a professional. I had been trained to swallow things that were cold and keep working. The month was going to be the longest month of my life. The flight home left Las Vegas at 6 in the evening. Orla sat beside me in the aisle. She had booked herself on my flight without telling me, which was the kind of thing she did when she decided I was not safe to be alone with myself on a commercial aircraft for 4 hours. She did not speak to me for the first hour. She opened a book she was not reading and let me sit with my face turned to the window and my body absorbing the specific kind of tired that comes from losing a fight and from the thing that had happened inside the losing. Somewhere over the desert, she closed the book. She said, "I am not going to ask you what she said." I said, "Good." She said, "I am going to ask you one question, and then I am not going to ask again until you bring it up yourself." I said, "Ask." She said, "Did you tell her the truth about why you sent that book?" I turned from the window. Orla had known about the book. Orla had, 2 years ago, sat across a table from me in a diner in Albany and watched me place an order for a specific hardcover edition at the bookstore 2 doors down, and had not said a word about it then, and had not said a word about it since. I said yes. She said, "Then you did the right thing in the room." She opened the book again. She did not speak to me again until the plane was on the ground. The first week, I did nothing. Nothing is not quite right. I woke up. I stretched. I walked to the gym. I did the light recovery work Orla's post-fight protocol required, which after a 12-round title fight was genuinely very light, and I came home and I ate what my nutritionist told me to eat, and I slept for 9 hours a night. I did all of this on autopilot because autopilot was the only available setting. I did not call Sabine. She did not call me. This was the agreement. I held the agreement because holding the agreement was the only thing I could offer her from across the country, as evidence that I had heard her when she said a month. The media did not hold any agreement. The first interview request came 3 days after the fight, a boxing podcast. I declined. The second came 2 days later, a sports network. I declined. The third, on day 10, came from the most watched boxing journalist in the country, a woman named Adair Volk, who had covered me since my third professional fight, and who had, over the years, earned the specific kind of trust that journalists earn when they spend 5 years refusing to sensationalize the stories that could have made their careers. Adair sent a handwritten note. The note said, "I am not going to ask you anything you do not want to answer. I would like to do a 20-minute sit-down on your career going forward. I will send the questions in advance. You can strike any of them. I said yes to Adair because Adair had earned a yes. We filmed the interview on day 14 in the gym, with Orla standing just off camera in case I wobbled. Adair had sent the questions. They were about my training camp, my thoughts on the rematch, my plans for the rest of the year. She had included one question about the third fight's legacy, and I had asked her to strike it, and she had struck it without argument. The interview went well. We talked for 22 minutes. Adair, at the end, thanked me and closed her notebook and gestured for the camera to be cut. Then she said, "Remy, off the record." I said, "Okay." She said, "Sabini's team denied a request I put in last week. That is not unusual. What is unusual is that Sabine herself called me afterward and asked me to tell you, if I ever had the chance, that she is doing the arithmetic and it is holding." I stared at Adair. Adair said, "I do not know what that means." I was told you would. I said, "I do." Adair said, "Okay. That is all. I hope the recovery is going well." She left. I sat in the gym after she was gone with the lights off, and Orla unwrapping the hand pads I had not actually hit anything with, and I thought about the specific logistics of Sabine Corvino, who had told me she was going to put a month between the hallway and whatever happened next, calling a journalist neither of us fully trusted in order to send me a 5-word message through a professional intermediary that she knew I would read correctly, and nobody else would read at all. The arithmetic is holding. Meaning, I have not called you, I am not going to call you. But I am aware that the silence is costing something, and I did not want you to sit inside it wondering whether I had changed my mind. It was the most considerate thing anyone had ever done for me in my professional life. Orla finished unwrapping the pads. She turned to me. She said, "Good message." I said, "You heard." She said, "I heard." I said, "Do not ask me about it." She said, "I will not." The third week, the rumor started. It started small. A boxing blog nobody read outside the industry ran a piece suggesting that the unusual physicality of my handshake with Sabine after the second fight had been the subject of backroom speculation for years. The piece did not name sources. It was speculative and thinly written, and would have died in 48 hours if another, larger outlet had not picked it up and reframed it as a legitimate question about the rivalry's deeper dynamics. By day 21, there were 2 national publications running think pieces on the rivalry that used phrases like unresolved tension and the unanswered question at the heart of women's boxing in ways that made it clear the writers were circling something they did not have the evidence to name but had decided collectively to imply. Nobody had seen the hallway. The hallway had been private. The weigh-in cameras had not caught it. The reporters who had been 20 feet away had, by all available evidence, been looking the other direction. There was no photograph. There was no footage. There was only the thing that had happened and the 2 women who had been inside it, both of whom had every professional incentive to treat the rumor as what it officially was, which was unsupported speculation. My publicist called me on day 22. She said, "We need to get ahead of this." I said no. She said, "Remy, they are not going to stop. You need to give them a denial." I said, "A denial of what?" "No one has asked me a specific question. I am not going to preemptively deny something nobody has the standing to ask me about." She said, "This is going to get worse." I said, "Let it get worse." She said, "Remy, this is your career." I said, "It is my career, and I am going to handle it. And the way I am going to handle it is by not giving the cycle a new sentence to clip. Thank you for your work. I will talk to you next week." I hung up. I sat on the edge of my couch and looked at the ceiling and thought about what I had just decided. I had just decided, effectively, that I was not going to publicly deny being in love with Sabine Corvino, which was a different thing from confirming it. But the difference in the current media environment was not going to matter to anyone except me and her. My phone rang at 11 that night. I did not recognize the number. I answered because at 11 at night the universe owed me an explanation. Sabine said, "Are you okay?" I said, "You broke the month." She said, "I know. My publicist called me 3 hours ago. She wanted me to issue a denial. I said, "Mine did too." "I did not." She said, "I know. That is why I called. I saw your statement, which was the fact that you had not made one, and I wanted to know if you had made that choice deliberately or if you were just too tired to engage." I said, "Deliberately." She said, "I am not going to make one either." I said, "Okay." A long silence. The specific kind of silence of two people on a phone line in two different cities, breathing. She said, "I am not calling to talk. I am calling to tell you I am not calling," which I know sounds absurd, but I wanted you to know that the silence is not because something changed. I am holding the month. I will hold the month. I wanted you to hear my voice once so you knew. I said, "Sabine?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I am going to hang up now." I said, "Okay." She hung up. I put the phone face down on the coffee table and I sat on the floor in my living room and I put my hands over my face. And I did the closest thing to crying that I had done in maybe 7 years, which was a quiet shaking that lasted about 4 minutes, and then passed. I was a fighter. I had been trained since I was 15 to let things pass. I had never been trained for this particular thing, but the training held anyway, because the training had been about holding things in general, and general holding turned out to be enough. The month ended on a Tuesday. It was the 31st day. I knew because I had been counting. I had been counting in the specific way you count the hours before a fight, the math running automatically in the back of your mind even when you were trying to think about something else. I woke up on day 31 and I made coffee, and I looked at my phone, and I did not call. She called at 9 in the morning. She said, "The month is up." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am flying to New York on Thursday." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you are in New York and I am not going to have this conversation on a phone." I said, "Okay." She said, "I will text you when I land." I said, "Okay." She said, "Remy." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am nervous. I wanted you to know." I said, "So am I." She said, "Good. We will be nervous together then." She hung up. She landed at 6 on Thursday evening. I met her at a restaurant in the East Village that a friend of mine owned, because I did not want us to have the conversation in my apartment, and because I did not want us to have it in a hotel, and because the restaurant was small enough that we would be noticed by the staff, but large enough that we would not be noticed by anyone who mattered. My friend had seated us at a two-top in the back and had instructed her waitstaff to treat us like any other customers. Sabine came in at 6:20. She was in dark pants and a gray sweater and she had cut her hair, or had someone else cut it, since Las Vegas. It was shorter now. The cut on her eyebrow had healed into a thin pale line. She saw me. She stood at the door for a second. Then she crossed the restaurant and sat down across from me. She said, "Hi." I said, "Hi." She said, "Your face healed well." I said, "Yours did too." She said, "Is this weird?" I said, "It is the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me." She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth. Barely. We ordered. We ate. We talked. For the first 20 minutes. About nothing in particular. Her flight. My training schedule. A mutual acquaintance who had recently retired. We were feeling out the rhythm of talking to each other in a room where neither of us had a professional reason to be. Then, sometime after the entrees arrived, she set her fork down. She said, "I have been thinking about how to say this." I said, "Say it." She said, "The book was not the first thing." I said, "Okay." She said, "The first thing was your press conference before our first fight. You said in the press conference when they asked you what you thought of me as a fighter, that I was the most complete boxer in the division, and that you were going to lose to me unless you found the one weakness I had not yet exposed, which you did not think you were going to find in the time available. You said it on the record. You said it to a room full of reporters who were expecting you to talk trash. You said it because you thought it was true, and you were not interested in lying to sell tickets." I watched the footage 11 times. I said, "I did not know you watched it." She said, "I watched everything you gave on record for the first 3 years. That was my version of the training." I said. My version, too. She said. The first thing was the press conference. The second thing was the handshake after our first fight. You held the handshake because you were trying to catch my eye and tell me, without saying anything anyone could quote, that I had not actually beaten you and you were going to come back and get me. I understood the message. I thanked you for it by letting the handshake go on as long as you wanted. That was 2 years before the book. I said, you never told me. She said, I could not tell you. I was your rival. I had a career to protect. I had a team that paid their mortgages on my career, and I had sponsors who paid for my career, and I had a trainer who had been dying of pancreatic cancer during all of this, which I had not told anyone, and which meant that my entire professional life during the stretch of time when I was falling in love with you was organized around a grief I could not make public. I did not have the bandwidth to be in love with you on top of everything else. So I was not. Officially. I said, Vic was sick when we fought the first time. She said Vic was sick from the week we signed the contract for the first fight. He knew. I knew. He made me promise not to tell anyone, and I promised. And then I had to stand in a ring and beat you while he was in a hospital bed in Los Angeles. And the only thing that got me through it was that you were boxing the best fight of your career, and you had decided, for reasons I did not understand, to be honorable about it. I said, Sabine? She said, let me finish. I said, okay. She said, the book arrived 3 months after Vic died. I had been trying for 8 weeks to find a copy. The estate was a disaster. His wife was angry at me for reasons I will not go into and had put a hold on all of his personal effects, and I had no legal standing to object. I had told 2 people I was trying to find the book. One of them was a journalist who had published it as a side note in a profile of me. You read the profile. You went and found the book. You sent it to me anonymously so I would not have to thank you. I said, yes. She said, the problem is that anonymous gifts are more telling than signed ones. Anonymous gifts tell you exactly who the person is. They tell you that someone is paying attention to you in a way they have decided not to admit to, which means the attention is not about credit. That was when I understood that I was not the only one who had been quietly not saying something. That was when the real problem started. I said, why did you wait 2 years? She said, because I was the champion and you were the challenger and we had a fight scheduled, and I had a team, and you had a team, and there was no version of the story where I crossed the hallway at a weigh-in and did what I did that did not look like the champion taking advantage of the challenger. I waited 2 years because I could not find the version where it was allowed. I said, the hallway did not look like that. She said, the hallway looked like that to me. I have been inside my own head about the hallway for 5 weeks. I said, the hallway did not look like that to me. She looked at me. I said, I am going to tell you the actual truth about the hallway. I had been waiting for you to do something for 2 years. I had been waiting specifically. Every press conference, every face-off, every public appearance we did together, I watched your hands and your eyes and the specific way your shoulders sat in whatever you were wearing, and I was waiting for you to give me one piece of evidence that I was not the only person cataloging. You gave me the evidence in the ballroom the day before. I spent the night not sleeping. I came to the weigh-in already knowing I was going to do something. You did it first. I was relieved. She said, you were relieved. I said yes. I was relieved that I was not going to have to be the one to push you against a wall. I had spent the whole night planning how I would do it if you did not. I had worked out exactly where I was going to stand, and exactly what I was going to say, and exactly what I was going to do if you hit me in response, which I had accounted for as a 20% possibility. You made it unnecessary. I have been grateful for that every day since. She stared at me. She said, you were going to push me against a wall. I said, I was going to push you against a wall. Yes. She said, Remy. I said, we are the same kind of crazy, Sabine. We have always been the same kind of crazy. The only difference is that you got there first because you had 8 weeks of grieving your trainer to push you over the edge of what you were willing to do in public. I had not had my own version of that yet. Your version happened first. That is the only reason the hallway looked like what it looked like. She put her hands flat on the table. She was looking at them. Her shoulders were shaking very slightly. She was laughing. It was not a happy laugh. It was the laugh a person makes when they have been carrying a specific misunderstanding for 5 weeks and have just been told that the misunderstanding was structural. The laugh of a person who has been telling themselves a story about the weight of their own wrong and has just learned that the weight was never only theirs. She said, I have been accounting for a thing that was not what I thought it was. I said, yes. She said, for 5 weeks. I said, yes. She said, I was going to tell you tonight that I could not see you for at least 6 months because I needed to make sure I was not the person I had been telling myself I was. I said, that is not necessary. She said, I am aware of that now. The waiter came. We ordered dessert we were not going to eat. The waiter left. Sabine looked up. Her eyes were wet, which I had never seen on her face in 4 years. She did not try to hide it. She sat across the table from me with her eyes wet and her hands flat on the tablecloth, and she said, so what do we do? I said, we have dinner. She said, and after? I said, we have dinner again, and then we have dinner again, and eventually we figure out what we are to each other when neither of us is trying to beat the other one. She said, we have a rematch scheduled for September. I said, I know. She said, I have been trying to figure out what to do about that. I said, we are going to fight it. She said, Remy. I said, listen, we are the 2 best fighters in our division. The rematch is a unification fight with every belt on the line. You are going to try to beat me, and I am going to try to beat you, and one of us is going to win, and one of us is going to lose, and neither of those outcomes is going to change what we are to each other outside the ring. If we cannot do that, we are not actually as in control as we have been telling ourselves for 4 years, and we should probably retire and get civilian jobs. I do not want a civilian job. You do not want a civilian job. We are going to fight it. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, you are very calm about this. I said, I have had a month to think about it. You are not the only one who had to account for things. She said, what did you account for? I said, I accounted for the possibility that you were going to call me at the end of the month and tell me you could not do this, and I decided that if that was what you decided, I was going to respect it. And then I accounted for the possibility that you were going to call me and we were going to be able to do this, and I decided that if that was what happened, I was not going to be the one who made it complicated. You have been the one carrying the complicated part of this for 2 years. I am not going to add to it. She said, that is a gift. I said, you gave me one first. You called me through a journalist in the middle of the silence so I would not think you had changed your mind. That was the gift. I am trying to give it back. She said, Remy. I said, yes. She reached across the table. She did not touch my hand. She laid her own hand flat on the tablecloth, palm up, 3 inches from mine. It was an offer, not a claim. I put my hand in hers. It was the first time in 4 years of knowing each other that we had touched without a glove between us or without a fight around us. Her hand was warm, her palm was calloused from tape and rope and the specific daily labor of being a professional. My hand fit inside hers in the way hands fit when they have been made by the same kind of work. She said, okay. I said, okay. We ate the dessert. We split the check. We walked out into the New York evening, which was cool and loud and full of the particular energy that New York has when it is not paying attention to you, and we walked for 8 blocks in no direction before she said, I am staying at a hotel near Union Square. I said, I will walk you there. She said, okay. At the door of her hotel on the sidewalk, with people moving around us the way people move in New York without noticing 2 women standing at a door, I stopped. I said, I am not coming upstairs tonight. She said, I know. I said, I want to. She said, I know. I said, we are going to do this patiently. She said, yes. I said, I will see you tomorrow. She said yes. She put her hand on my cheek. Just her palm. The same warm hand I had held across the restaurant table 40 minutes earlier. She held it there for 3 seconds. She did not kiss me. She did not pull me in. She took her hand off my cheek. She went through the door. She did not look back. I walked home. The rematch was signed the following Tuesday. The promoter tried to sell it as a grudge match. Sabine and I both refused. In parallel interviews our respective teams had coordinated without telling us. We both said, in approximately the same words, that the third fight had been the end of the rivalry, and the rematch was going to be something else. We did not say what. The promoter was displeased. The publicist community was confused. The fight sold out in 40 minutes anyway. We trained in our separate camps for 4 months. During those 4 months we saw each other 6 times. Once in New York, twice in Los Angeles, where her gym was. 3 times in neutral cities where one or the other of us had a media obligation and the other had flown in for the weekend. We were very careful. We were patient. We were, for the first 2 months, primarily friends, which was a thing neither of us had quite been to another person in a long time. In the 3rd month, on a Sunday afternoon in a park in Griffith, she kissed me on a bench while we were watching 2 children try to fly a kite that kept nosing into the ground. It was nothing like the hallway. It was patient. Her hand came up to my jaw first, warm, deliberate. She waited. She waited for my face to tell her yes. My face told her yes. She kissed me with the specific, unhurried attention of a woman who had spent 5 months accounting for every gram of the thing she was doing and had decided, that afternoon, on a bench in a park, that the accounting was finished. I did not say anything for a long moment after. The kite went down again. One of the children laughed. I said, "That was much better." She said, "I had some motivation to do it correctly this time." I said, "Duly noted." She laughed. The same laugh as the restaurant. Unguarded. I had heard it maybe 4 times by then and was keeping a private count. The fight was in September. We weighed in on a Friday. Same promoter, same hotel, different hallway, because the promoter, on Orla's quiet suggestion, had restructured the weigh-in logistics in a way that meant the 2 teams did not wait in the same corridor this time. Orla had not explained why she had suggested it. The promoter had not asked. Some things did not need to be explained. Sabine and I did the face-off. 5 seconds, eye contact, a small professional distance that was, to the cameras, indistinguishable from the face-offs we had done 4 times before. She said, under her breath, "Just for me. Tomorrow." I said, "Tomorrow." We separated. The fight was 12 rounds again. It was as hard and as clean and as technically committed as the 3rd fight had been, and by some people's count it was better. I won. I won on a split decision that was more generous to me than the actual arithmetic of the fight, which I had seen 4 ways from the 5th round onward. Sabine did not contest it. She put her arms around me in the center of the ring in the same way I had put mine around her in March, and her mouth was at my ear. She said, "You boxed beautifully." I said, "You too." She said, "Congratulations, champ." I said, "Sabine." She said, "Yes." I said, "Come home with me tonight." She said, "Yes." The post-fight press conference was brief. At the end, a reporter I did not recognize raised her hand. She was young. She had the specific nervousness of a journalist who had been told by her editor to ask questions she was not sure was a good idea. She said, "There have been rumors about the nature of your relationship for months. Would either of you like to address them?" The room, which had been loud, got quiet. Sabine looked at me. I looked at her. We had not planned for this question. We had not prepared a statement. We had been too busy being patient with each other to rehearse a public posture. Sabine said, "Go ahead." I said, "The nature of our relationship is that we are the 2 best boxers in our division, and we just put on the best 12 rounds either of us is ever going to put on. Beyond that, it is our business, and we are going to handle it on a timeline that is ours, and not a timeline that is yours." The reporter nodded. She sat down. No one else raised a hand. We left the press conference. Sabine held the door. In the hallway outside the ballroom, I took her hand. She did not flinch. I did not flinch. We walked down the corridor toward the elevator together, and the building noise moved around us, and nobody said anything that mattered, and the world did not end. And we got in the elevator, and the doors closed. She said, "That went better than I thought it would." I said, "I had a speech prepared." She said, "You did not have a speech prepared." I said, "I had a concept of a speech. It assembled itself on demand." She laughed. We went upstairs. The hotel room was quiet. The curtains were open. The city was spread out below us in the particular way Las Vegas spreads out at night, which was all lights and no geography. I stood at the window. Sabine came up behind me. She did not touch me. She stood at my shoulder and looked out at the city with me, and the silence between us was not the silence of two people waiting for something. It was the silence of two people who had already arrived. She said, "I was in love with you the whole time." I said, "I know." She said, "I wanted you to hear me say it without a wall between us." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I am going to be in love with you for a long time." I said, "I know that too." She said, "I want to say it anyway." I said, "Say it." She said, "I love you, Remy Aguilar. I have loved you since a press conference 4 years ago. I love you in a way that has been the most organizing principle of my professional life. I am done pretending it is not." I turned from the window. I looked at her. I said, "I love you too. I have loved you since you held the handshake after our first fight. I sent you the book because I could not stand the idea of you trying to find it alone. I went to the weigh-in planning to kiss you if you did not kiss me. I have been in love with you for 2.5 years, and I have boxed the best fights of my career inside that love. None of it has ever not been true." She put her hand on my jaw. It was the same hand, the same warm, calloused, deliberate hand that had touched my cheek outside the hotel near Union Square 5 months earlier and had touched my jaw on a park bench in Griffith in July. She cupped my face. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she kissed me. It was not the hallway. It was not the bench. It was the third version. It was the version where we had spent 5 months putting down the weight of the rivalry piece by piece and had finally come to the end of the carrying, and the kiss was the specific quiet thing that happens when two people who have finished their work finally get to do the thing the work had been holding the space for. Her hand stayed on my jaw. My hand went to the small of her back. The city lights moved outside the window in the way city lights move, which is not at all, and the hotel was quiet. And the only sound in the room was the sound of two fighters who had stopped fighting. We stayed at the window for a long time. She rested her forehead against mine. She was breathing in that specific way she breathed when she was about to say something that cost her, the way I had learned to read over 4 years of cataloging. She said, "I was afraid, for a long time, that I was going to lose something real in order to have this." I said, "What have you lost?" She said, "Nothing." That is the thing. I lost nothing. I won a title belt, and I lost a title belt. And I have the same job and the same trainer and the same life, and the only thing that is different is that I get to tell you this. I said, "You do get to tell me this." She said, "As often as I want." I said, "As often as you want." She said, "Remy." I said, "Yes." She said, "Come to bed." I went to bed. The next morning, on the way to the airport, we stopped at a diner. We ate breakfast. We read the newspaper. Adair Volk had written a piece about the fight. It ran in the morning edition of 3 different national publications, and it was, I thought, the most accurate piece of boxing journalism Adair had ever produced, which was saying a lot. The piece did not address the press conference question. It addressed the 12 rounds. It addressed the specific technical choices we had each made in the 7th round when the fight had turned, and the specific way both of us had gone into the 10th, knowing we needed to steal it, and had then put on what Adair called the most committed 3 minutes of women's boxing that she had ever seen in person. Sabine read the piece. She set the paper down. She picked up her coffee. She said, "Adair is good." I said, Adair is very good, she said. We are going to have to give her the real interview at some point. I said. At some point. She said. Not yet. I said. Not yet. She took my hand across the table. A waitress came by to refill our coffees. She did not look at our hands. She did not say anything. She poured the coffee and she moved on. Nothing happened. The world did not end. Nobody asked us to be different than we were. We drank the coffee and we read the paper, and we held hands across a diner table in Las Vegas on a Sunday morning, and at some point we paid the check, and we got in a cab to the airport, and at the gate she kissed me once, briefly, in public. The kind of kiss two people give each other when they are about to be apart for a week and have decided calmly that they do not mind being seen. She went through security. She turned at the top of the ramp. She raised her hand. I raised mine. She went through the gate. I flew home on a different flight. On the plane, Orla sat beside me in the aisle. She had not booked herself on my flight this time. I had asked her to. Some habits were worth keeping. She said, "Good fight." I said, "Good camp." She said, "It is going to be a long road." I said, "I know." She said, "You are ready for it." I said, "I know." Orla opened her book. She started reading. She did not speak to me again for the rest of the flight. The plane lifted. The city disappeared under the wing. I looked out the window at the desert going gold in the afternoon light, and I thought about the hallway in March, and the kitchen in Albany 2 years before that, and the press conference 4 years before that, and the specific long road that had been the road between those rooms and the Las Vegas morning I was flying away from. I thought about the arithmetic. I thought about how the arithmetic had always been holding, on both sides of it, for much longer than either of us had been willing to admit. I thought about Sabine Corvino landing on the opposite coast in 4 hours, and unpacking her bag, and sitting on the edge of her own bed in Los Angeles and picking up her phone. My phone buzzed, a text from her. It said, "Made it." I wrote back, "Me too." She wrote, "Tuesday?" I wrote, "Tuesday." I put the phone face down on the tray. I closed my eyes. Orla turned a page. The plane hummed. It had been a long road. It was going to be a long road. I had, by every measurable standard, exactly the right person to walk it with, which was the thing that had been true since the first fight, and which I had spent 4 years pretending was not the case. I was done pretending. She was too. That was, it turned out, enough.